Okay, thanks so much, Claudia, for inviting me to be part of today. That was just brilliant and really inspiring. I didn't get to ask my question, but I will ask it later. But some of it I was thinking about was how important this work is to share, which you've obviously done today, but how other institutions can learn from what the WIT was doing, but what you're doing. So I'm really excited to hear about that work you're doing that you mentioned with other museums and policy making, and would love to hear more about that. So thank you. My name's Jenny, and I'm the director of the Barber Institute, which is part of the University of Birmingham. And this is the second panel of the day, and it focuses on decentering exhibition histories, which is something very close to my heart because I work in a regional space. Birmingham, amazing infrastructure, arts ecology there, and I previously worked in Cambridge for a very long time. So I'm very pleased to be here today, and I want to say thanks to PMC, to Claudia, for actually bringing these sessions together with such care, and I think that's a really nice way into the PMC, which always seems to feel as though it does this in a careful way and a supportive way. So thank you all for your support in asking questions after our two panellists. So I think we're going to go, we've got time, yeah, great, and we're going to go straight through, so have both these papers together, and then we'll have a similar Q&A afterwards, and I'm sure there'll be lots to say, as there has been already today. So the first speaker in this panel is Dr. Hana. Come in, Hana. I've managed to get your presentation on the screen, which I'm proud of myself for. So Hana is, and this is quite a mouthful, the John Moores Painting Prize embedded post holder and co-director of the Exhibition Research Lab and Research Centre at Liverpool John Moores University Institute for Art and Technology. And together with Dr. Sophie Hatchwell from the University of Birmingham, who's a close colleague of mine, she co-convenes the British Art Network affiliated post-war paintings in regional collection research group. And the forthcoming book, which you're working on collaboratively, is called Collaborative Art History in Practice Post-1945 UK Art Collections and Regional Research Ecosystems. And it's coming out soon, I think, hopefully. Great, with Routledge. So we're very much looking forward to when that will be published. And thank you.
Thank you, Jenny. Hi, sorry, that was very wordy. I'll work on my bio for next time. Is it just arrows to move the screens? Yeah, great. Okay, so just to make this clear, this is based on collaborative work undertaken with Dr. Sophie Hatchwell and with the post-war British Paintings in Regional Collections Research Group. So it's very much collaborative piece of research based on partnerships between researchers based within regional contexts. The group was founded in 2019. We wanted to focus on the post-war era because we'd identified that there's this complex shift in aesthetics since the 1950s, and it chimes with the many social and political shifts that mark this period, including breakdown of colonialism, changing attitudes to gender, sexuality, and class. And there is very little specific research into regional collections in this period. There is a dearth in general of research into regional collections and the great potential for activation of under-researched histories and geographies. But there is some around the 19th century when a lot of these collections were formed, but then it just sort of trails off and discontinues as you get into the post-war period. So our initial goals were to support new interpretations of regional collections, to uncover concealed histories, and to work collaboratively across sectors. So researchers in regional collections who could be independents, who could be based at higher education institutions, and within museums, galleries, libraries, archives. Our first tranche of activity, funded by the British Art Network, raised a host of fresh questions. So for every sort of iteration of the, we call them tranches, we redefine the questions based on feedback from our members in order to remain relevant and as useful as possible to our members. So what we wanted to know from our second tranche was that what can our regional painting collections tell us about the relationship between the regional, the local and the global in post-war Britain and in galleries today? How might our understanding of regional post-war collections change as we interrogate the marginalisation of artists of global ethnic heritages, of women, of working class artists and queer artists? And how can current research conducted both within and across higher education and museum sectors usefully shape new interpretations of regional post-war collections? So for our seventh activity, we decided to come together to do a sort of collective piece of research based on an audit of materials of historical exhibition catalogues. This is where the John Moores Painting Prize comes in. So the John Moores Painting Prize is not present in any art histories. But it's such an important resource for artists mid-century until the present day, and also for curators and researchers. So it was established in 1957 and has run biennially since. And John Moore's intention in founding it was to bring the best new art to Merseyside and to encourage post-war cultural regeneration independently from central government and the metropolis. And he wrote a letter to The Guardian in which he says we shouldn't be relying on funding from central government. It's not coming. Let's galvanise ourselves and get this done ourselves. And really importantly to this piece of research, the prize is anonymously judged, which John Moores insisted that it should be this way. He was the thwarted amateur artist who felt like he could never get his work into exhibitions because he didn't know the right people, he didn't have the right education, didn't know the right networks. Both John Moores and ourselves hope that this theoretically creates a more level playing field for artists. So judges don't know who they are. They can't sort of, there's no subconscious bias. There is subconscious bias, but there's less. So the works by first prize winners in the first three editions are fairly well-known names, not at the time, but now. But what gets really interesting is as you go into the runner-up prizes, the supporting prizes, the range of artists becomes much more diverse. There are more women, there are more artists who are not born within Britain. One of the stipulations of the prize is when you submit, you must be working within Britain at that time. So it doesn't actually matter if you live somewhere else full-time, as long as you have an address in the UK as you submit. So the activity took place in 2021 under lockdown conditions. And a key aim in using this method, this was a bit of a wild card. We did not know how this was going to go, but what we did feel was a responsibility to our members to produce an activity that we could participate in that was effective, that would be a collaborative activity and would be accessible to all of our members. And we were also really, really aware that individuals and institutions have been very differently affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. And many of our constituents were maybe more affected than their colleagues. And the return to research would be delayed for many people. So we wanted to produce a model and a data set that members could return to in the future. So it exists independently from an activity that runs, say, between 2 and 4 o'clock. It can be returned to, and we can provide access for that. So prior to the workshop, we set up the resources, we made the catalogues available, we created the spreadsheets, we very much reliant on Google Docs. We ensured that it all worked, that members received clear information, that it was accessible, and we set really clear goals beforehand so that people knew what we were attempting to achieve and why they were here. We introduced distinctive categories for investigation. So we wanted to know how many women were represented, was there queer representation, what age groups were dominant, were amateurs successful entrants, were certain art schools prevalent, were artists largely from the regions or the capital, what kinds of genres proliferated, which becomes important when you're trying to trace networks of artists who are maybe based in regional art schools, or the types of art that regional galleries have collected and forms the foundation of their collection, in terms of positionality and placemaking, both as it affects their future programming and as it reflects their constituents. If works are still extant, whether they are in collections, and many of these works are still extant, many of them are what would be termed museum quality, and have gone into major regional collections, less have been collected by the national collections, so there's already an interesting distinction there. So we worked together in real time with the first catalogue from 1957. We started at that point so that further investigation could follow on chronologically, but also because in terms of the network, it was closest to the very immediate post-war period that we were really interested in. In that year, there were 2,059 entries, so they all come in from around the country in physical form, and the jurors yay or nay them, and then 181 remain, the rest go off to their owners. So that leaves 144 artists because some had 2 works accepted. And we divided up the 144 between attendees. And using the resources available to us from our home working stations, we set out to record as much data as possible within the categories that I just discussed, so age, gender, etc. And through ongoing discussion, because as we worked collaboratively and we've seen everyone's colours appearing on the spreadsheet, we conferred about the blind spots in our pre-configured categories. And there were blind spots. So 1957, it's still illegal to be openly queer. So, how would you find that out anyway from the limited data given? So what we had to do was to bring our existing expertise and knowledge to bear on that question. There were artists like Duncan Grant who'd been invited rather than submitted, who you could say identifiably. And I'll talk a little bit about how we've used that and how we've modified that category to be a more open and inclusive conception of queer art and artists. And to discuss any striking findings that were sort of coming up at the time. It was quite exciting, the things that we were discovering. And we continued to work collaboratively after the event. It's ended up being a huge amount of data. Like, somehow I hadn't conceptualized what that would look like in terms of stats. So we were able to employ a researcher, Dr. Claire Matthews, to continue to work with the catalogues and input afterwards. Some of the participants continued, and the conveners, Sophie and myself, continued. So we ended up with complete audits for 57 and 61. And we produced a lot of data subsets based on the categorization, which we still haven't had the full opportunity to go through. And I think we need to take some expert guidance from maybe colleagues from other subject areas who are more familiar with how to use sets of large data, and maybe we'll be able to suggest things that we're overlooking because we don't quite have that comprehension of what this data can do. So we've also worked with LJMU students to trace works from the exhibition that were bought by regional galleries, and we've used Art UK to do that. It's been really effective, and also auction catalogues. And we've continued to share information and developments about the audit through the network. And just the activity shaped further events for us, so it made us have more of a focus on methodologies, of group working methodologies, and there was a real focus after this point on co-production and the sort of constituent museum frameworks. I'm not going to look at the databases, but we came up with all kinds of different permutations of what we were looking at. So for all artists, we excluded the invited artists who tended to be more established, white, British, male, associated with the pre-war modernist period. And we looked at prize winners only. So stats about gender. 19 artists listed as Miss, 4 as Misses. This is one occasion when schematic sexism was actually quite useful because that was a really clear result. As a percentage of the 144 artists, 16% were women. Out of a total of 23 prizes awarded, 2 went to a woman, so only 8.67%, so a differentiation there already. 18% of artists had 2 work chosen. So when you look at the representations of the data in terms of age, this is with the invited artists, it is skewed towards older artists. When you look at the next pie chart, which is excluding the invited artists, it's much more skewed towards younger artists. What really blew my mind is that when you look at a breakdown of age and gender, which excludes the invited artists, between the ages of 35 and 55, you have 2 women. So where are all the women artists at this point? Well, given that there are 19 misses and quite a lot of women who are students in the younger categories, that sort of narrative arc at which point women artists begin to drop out seems to be the point at which they become misses. What was more cheering was that in the older category there are more women than men. So sort of a real resurgence in the 60s when maybe the nappies are all changed and the pram is out of the hall. So some samples of the questions that were the further questions that have been surfaced by the audit that we haven't worked on yet, but we are working together with a group of early career researchers who have interests in the careers of émigré women artists, the careers of queer artists. So the audit led us to question other effective methodologies for researching regional exhibitions and collections, particularly in the absence of accessible archives. Not much of an available archive for the John Moores Painting Prize. There are materials, but at the moment they are not physically accessible. Questions such as, do patterns of national migration revealed by the audit identify previously unresearched networks of artists in the regions? Yes, they do, but we need to pay closer attention to what those networks are. Something that we traced were, so where were people born by region? Where did people go to art school? And where are people situated as professional artists? So you can trace those journeys, interregional migration. Regional art schools, the sort of connections between them, what kind of work was being produced, what information do they reveal about placemaking and regional identities. What kind of institutions have collected these work, and what does that tell us about the nature of their post-war collections and policies? So some of the outputs have been a digital curation where we've reunited all the works that we can trace from 1957, which is kind of amazing if you're interested in the aesthetics of post-war art. And, you know, we have certain ideas about what that looks like, but when you actually look at these works, does that confirm or confound expectation? We wrote a short story for Art UK that kind of just skims over some of the data and tells you some of the initial findings. We have presentations of new research generated by audit work, and we are proposing an edited collection of essays and an exhibition based on the work by those early career researchers. So, in summary, collaborative work with historical exhibition catalogues has enabled researchers to identify fresh questions about the artists who participated and about the works that they produced. The audit has animated histories that were previously dormant, inspired new interpretations of regional collections, and generated equitable research ecologies. We've harnessed regionally rooted expertise to intervene in nationally relevant debates around British cultural histories and identities. A number of key themes emerged, and regional institutions are shown to be active agents in the construction of the post-war art world, with regional exhibitions playing a key role in shaping pluralistic and mobile cultural identities. And we're attempting to rethink the geographies and demographics of post-war British art practice and collections formation. And just again to reiterate that this was collaborative work. I'm just the spokesperson today.
Thank you, Hana. I've got loads of questions. I was nearly going to ask you one, but I'm going to hold it. I'll get carried away. Okay, lovely. So our next speaker is Ella Nixon, who is at a very exciting stage because Ella has just submitted her PhD, she tells me. So I think that deserves a round of applause, actually. So Ella has just submitted her thesis, which is entitled Beyond the National, the Representation of Women Artists in Regional Art Galleries. And this was a Northern Bridge AHRC funded doctoral award in collaboration with Lang in Newcastle. Ella is also a research associate at the Arts Council Collection at the moment and has recently completed a 2-year research project at the Women's Art Collection at Murray Edwards College, the University of Cambridge, where she curated an amazing exhibition which was entitled Conversation, Not Spectacle, which has only just closed actually, March 2025, so I hope some people were able to see that. And that show delved into archives and brought out new histories about how that collection was formed and how the works were acquired. So incredible project. And before all of this, Ella completed her BA at the University of Cambridge and an MA at the Courtauld. So thank you, Ella, and welcome. And your paper is called The Unfashionable Local Regional Practices and the Challenge to Traditional Notions of Artistic Value.
Thank you for that introduction, and thank you, Claudia, and everyone here at the Paul Mellon Centre as well. Sorry, I think I'm a bit smaller than everyone else. Yeah.
Well, it was the same for me.
Thank you. Yeah. I just want to start by saying that I was involved in Hana and Sophie's project, and it was very fun. It kind of felt like we were at Bletchley Park all on our spreadsheets and kind of going away. I didn't think spreadsheets could be that fun, but it was. So it was, great project. So I'm especially pleased to be presenting because, as Jenny said, this is, I think it's the first paper since I actually submitted my PhD, and hopefully I can provide some glimpses into my research. I did actually change the title slightly from what I told you, I think. So I'm just going to say the title out in full because hopefully then you can kind of see how it ties in with what I say. So my title is The Regional Art Gallery. This is for my thesis, by the way. The Regional Art Gallery and Strategies for Collecting, Displaying and Integrating Women's Art in Britain, 1970 to 21. And here the notions of collecting, displaying and integrating are really important because throughout the talk I'll kind of touch upon how collections themselves within the regional galleries influence these exhibition practices. So I'm going to include 2 different approaches to exhibition making beyond the confines of London that both provide opportunities for the representation of women artists. As will become apparent in the talk, this kind of ties in with what we're hearing now in the national institutions and these histories that are being brought up, which have much deeper histories spanning from the 1970s especially. And I chose to start in 1970 for my thesis because this is usually the time that's kind of associated with the rise of feminist art history with Lynda Nocklin's essay. So many of you in the audience today, I'm sure, have visited the Women in Revolt exhibition, which was at the Tate Britain last year, and it also toured around the country as well. One of the most striking moments in the show for me was the video of a performance by Gina Birch, wherein her scream plays on loop, which is entitled 3-Minute Scream. This is a work of 1977. Its shrill tone and heightened volume established a soundscape of urgency to the overall exhibition. And we've talked a bit about urgency as well today, and I think feminist urgency is something that we can trace from the 1970s, and we still feel that today. Despite this conveyed urgency, though, like I said, the representation of feminist performance within public institutions is certainly not new. The Tate exhibition was significant in scale, partly due to its staging in a national institution, which underpinned its description as landmark by several commentators. However, I want to direct your attention to an earlier decade, an earlier time, to suggest how and why feminist interests have been represented in regional galleries. So in 1987, the feminist artist Helen Chadwick performed In the Kitchen, Electric Cooker, at the Laing Art Gallery in Newcastle upon Tyne. The artwork featured 4 women, including the artist herself, dressed to resemble kitchen appliances. This raised questions about the commercialized domestic space and the role of the housewife. This piece, in doing so, is an exploration of feminine identity. Stephen Walker argues that Chadwick believed that human experience far exceeded the limits policed by the great patriarchs, which Chadwick herself is quoted to describe as the Western inheritance from Plato to Descartes to Freud. Reference to the great patriarchs suggests Chadwick's preoccupation with feminism, significant for evidencing gender as a theme to address within a regional gallery space. Just the year before, the Laing had partnered with Projects UK, and this was a local arts organisation, for the New Work Newcastle Festival of 1986. And doing so, they staged a series of performances in the gallery. The collaboration was made partly to access central funding from the Arts Council's scheme, which was called The Glory of the Garden. This directed resources to, quote, diverse activities outside of London, and the medium of performance, which is an alternative to high art, such as oil painting and sculpture, was perhaps a means to kind of prove this diverse identity to the National Centre. And this was crucial for meeting the funding eligibility. However, the collaboration between the Laing and the Projects UK was, as reported in Performance magazine, riddled with problems and controversy. Projects UK complained about, quote, the Laing's trepidation about presenting work with the potential to outrage sensitive media. Media sensationalism over contemporary art easily leads to public criticism of institutions, local authority funders, and therefore receives hostility from the funders themselves, who don't want to kind of inflame tensions. I think we saw that in Manchester, the Whitworth as well. The public institutional identity of the Laing was therefore an obstacle for the representation of activist issues for Projects UK, suggesting that the radical opinions expressed by the performance artists were perceived to contradict with those of a wider public, or at least were too polarising to represent the moderate majority. Projects UK reacted by organising the following New Work Newcastle Festival events across the region rather than at the Laing, as was the case for the 1986 festival. Helen Cadwallader noted that the revised format of the 1988 festival enabled the, quote, presentation of more controversial themes and issue-based subject matter, less subject to the potential of being compromised or recuperated within institutionalised structures. I explore the tension between radical discourses and institutional identity at several points in my thesis, and this tension continues into the present day, and the desire to receive public funding, but the concurrent wishes to remain grassroots in identity and structure. So despite Projects UK complaining that they were not able to stage some of their more controversial themes, the performance of In the Kitchen by Helen Chadwick in 1987 at the Laing certainly brought feminist issues into a public institutional space through an in-house curated exhibition. And I think just to take a moment to kind of breathe here and think how radical this would have looked at the time, and still, you know, arguably so. So it is very significant that the Laing actually staged this performance. So in what ways was Chadwick's performance institutionalised? How did it make its way into the institution? In the Kitchen was staged as part of the group exhibition entitled 2D, 3D Art and Craft Made and Designed for the 20th Century in 1987, which was organised by Tyne and Wear Museum Service for the Laing and the Northern Centre for Contemporary Art. It is worth noting that the exhibition received financial support from the Arts Council of Great Britain, again suggesting the intersection of the national and regional and the desire to carve these alternative identities to the national centres. The exhibition directly challenged national and international narratives of Western art history itself. Curators John Millard, who was then the director of the Laing, and Tony Knipe summarise the exhibition as follows. The 2D, 3D exhibition is a celebration of works of art and craft set within a framework which deliberately disturbs the rigid compartments in which they are usually seen, in order to focus more clearly on the way in which the materials, production methods, and the intentions of artists and craftspeople affect the things they make. There is much to unpack about the radical intentions of this exhibition. Firstly, in terms of media or materials, the exhibition directly challenged accepted hierarchies. Works from the Laing's permanent collection that did not categorise as traditional high art featured. For example, Laura Knight's Circus Dinner Service of 1934. These painted ceramics, for example, a plate designed to be used at meal times rather than non-utilitarian art for art's sake, were described in the catalogue to imaginatively incorporate the figures of clowns as handles and combines transfer and painted decorations with great vivacity. And it's worth as well noting that these works actually made their way into the Laing because of the then director's friendship with Laura Knight. So we have these kind of patterns of a friendship and collaboration, and depending how these works got in the collection. So in this case, utilitarian objects were elevated to a sacred status through their display in a public gallery space. The breadth of 2D, 3D reflected the diverse media contained within the Laing's permanent collection, for example, including ceramics, tapestries, and prints. Mid-20th century commentators recognise how the permanent collections of regional galleries differed from those of their national counterparts. Former director of the Tate Gallery, John Rothenstein, commented, quote, "It is a curious fact about British provincial art galleries that the watercolours are almost always conspicuously superior to the oil paintings." This observation likely relates to financial considerations, insofar that regional galleries can better afford higher quality watercolours if we're going to use that system of valuation than oil paintings because of the lower overall price of the former medium. This constitutes an opportunity to represent women artists whose work is generally cheaper than that by men due to gender-based patterns of discrimination. Also speaking in the mid-20th century, then director of the National Gallery, Kenneth Clark, recognised the potential of regional galleries to carve identities different to national institutions. He advised that, quote, "Local galleries should be encouraged to collect work of local interest and not attempt to purchase expensive pictures in fashionable styles, which can be had on loan." I will develop the significance of locality in just a minute, but for now I want to explore what Clark meant by fashionable styles. To be fashionable suggests participation in or engagement with a current popular style. Performance work was not a media collected by national institutions, not least because of their continued aim to represent paintings in the Western European tradition, a tradition that has evolved over centuries and arguably reflects the precise structures that Chadwick sought to challenge. Millard and Knipe actively engaged in the activist potential of these unfashionable styles by flagging the intentions of artists and craftspeople as one element that they wished to explore in 2D, 3D. The inclusion of the word intentions reflects their recognition that artistic form and media are inevitably shaped by wider social, economic, and cultural considerations, with potentially unfashionable political repercussions. In this way, the aims of Chadwick, as contained and conveyed in her medium, resonated with the wider objectives of the 2D, 3D exhibition to challenge hierarchies of genre and interrogate identity. The curators could make use of an institutional identity developed as an alternative or peripheral to national institutions. Arguably, 2D, 3D was made possible due to the contracted version of the public envisaged by the Laying as a regional gallery. Whereas national galleries must appeal to international audiences on a large scale, warranting the staging of so-called blockbuster exhibitions, peripheral institutions appeal to more constricted audiences. And just to put this in context, in more recent context, in 2019 to 20, 84% of visitors to the Laying were from the northeast. And in the same report stated that 97% of their visitors were from the UK, and that can be compared to the National Gallery, who has a massive international audience base. So as the public for each gallery is radically different, the collecting policies and exhibition programming reflect these. The exhibition programming is affected by considerations of audience base because there is less requirement to represent the tried and tested, internationally famous and male blockbuster artists. This is just a snapshot of the National Gallery's previous fee-paying exhibitions over the past couple of years. The financial pressures associated with large corporate sponsors is also reduced, which may encourage a degree of risk-taking, as seen in collaboration with the outside organisation of Projects UK with the Laying in the 1980s, with their issue-based performance art. Moreover, fashionable implies a value system. I argue that this value system changes according to considerations of the gallery public due to assessments of relevance, which is a buzzword for attaining funding. Due to time, I'll highlight just one way in which this has shaped the representation of women artists in an exhibition form in regional galleries. In contrast to new media and its potential to challenge curatorial relations of power, such as Chadwick's performance, exhibitions of historic artists remain dominated by traditional media and curated according to biographical modes of interpretation, a chronological framework which is typically traced to the Renaissance scholar Vasari and which is manifest in the great artist narrative. Feminist art historians have criticised the biographical approach to art history as a structural framework for its exclusion of women artists. Nana Solomon, a major influence on Griselda Pollock, argued that the system created by Vasari had the effect of removing artists from social exchanges and instead demarcating artistic greatness based on inaccessible genius. The argument follows that the privileging of a certain gender, class, and race has shaped subsequent publications within art history, contributing to some art historians' understandings of the canon as an exclusive Western and male-centred structure. However, my analysis shows that the great artist narrative has been reframed within regional galleries to market lesser-known artists based on claims of locality. The National Gallery functions on a global stage as a repository of the world's finest art, and within this outlook, female artists are less likely to enter the collection because the artists are not deemed significant or familiar enough for an international audience, unlike those recognised within regional art galleries. Collecting practices influenced by localism can nuance the Western art canon without recourse to self-consciously feminist methodologies. Giles Waterfield, in his book Art Treasures of England, The Regional Collections, emphasises the importance of enhancing local identity as an aim of municipal art galleries as they developed from the 19th century. He describes, for example, that the sons and daughters of people in the community, the local community, would then have their works accepted into their galleries, and people would know these artists within the community. And he also suggested that the quality of works that entered these galleries were meant to kind of prove how good the local art schools were as well for visitors to the region. And the centrality of local art schools distinguishes regional collections on the national stage in contrast to the National Gallery, which speaks to an international public. So insofar that the National Gallery promotes the British school as a whole and houses foreign art. I illustrated this in a curatorial iteration through my exhibition Belonging at the Laying last year. One wall entitled Networks of Giving brought together works by female artists that had entered the Laying's collection based on local connections and networks. So, for example, Helen Hacking, the the artist who produced this work, donated the work next to hers by Christine Seddon. And Christine, sorry, I'll go back to my microphone. And Christine Seddon was Helen Hacking's tutor at Newcastle Art School. So I really thought about how I could kind of show this in a curatorial sense and build up this network, this alternative value system. So I found that local connections affected the programming of women artists at comparative regional art galleries as well, such as Manchester. A case study in point is the exhibition Annie Swinnerton, Painting Light and Hope, which was 2018-2019. In the regional context and recapitulating some of the central biographical concerns expressed by Pollock, the Swinnerton exhibition utilised a retrospective format to rediscover a woman artist. The shortened exhibition description claimed to be the first retrospective for nearly a century of the Manchester-born painter Annie Swinnerton, a pioneering professional artist who challenged convention in art and life. The phrases pioneering and challenged convention, along with the notion of rediscovery, are common stereotypical tropes for great women artist narratives. However, emphasis on locality provided contextual reference for the artists, which arguably helped to dispel the idea of artist as genius isolated from society. Swinnerton's identity as a woman artist was continually described in the context of Manchester. Hence, regional identity was fundamental to the exhibition narrative. The exhibition description outlines how, quote, portraits showing the artist's Manchester connections open the exhibition. Locality also influenced artwork interpretation. Looks like a very austere figure there, so I apologise. The cast log entry for the Reverend William Gaskell describes how the painting portrays a Manchester charity worker and was commissioned to commemorate his 40 years of service as chairman of the Portical Library in Manchester. It is then explained that Swinnerton's Manchester social connections go some way towards explaining how she was able to establish her artistic career in London. So they're constantly drawing these links between region and London. Lastly, it must be noted that the solo exhibition of Swinnerton comprised the large collection of works by the artist in Manchester's permanent collection, which totalled 13. And they also loaned in works as well, of course. Hence the inextricability of permanent collection and curatorial practices in a peripheral location, and the accordant opportunity to represent women artists. It can be concluded that appealing to more specific publics, rather than the wide public for the purpose of a blockbuster exhibition, provides scope for experimentation to challenge the traditional narratives of art history, whilst retaining the key buzzword of relevance. This can be done within the pre-existing canon, for example, through the Great Woman Artist narrative, or group exhibitions that contain unfashionable works from the permanent collection, or loaned-in works and performances that embody potentially challenging themes, in order to carve alternative institutional identities from those of national centres. Thank you.
Questions, only if you feel comfortable. I know some people don't want to do that, but if you do, that's just making online audiences feel like they're...
Did everyone hear that? If you ask a question, if you want to, please say who you are and where you're from. Thank you. Thanks, Sarah. Okay, thank you so much, both of you. Absolutely fascinating to me, all of this. And so much there, so many questions. This is the great thing about chairing a panel. You can quickly get your questions in. So, Hana, and actually Ella, you both... Well, Ella, you were talking about value systems there, and how questions of value are kind of created and by whom. And it made me think about your paper, Hana. And the burning question I had throughout that, with that data set, was who were the judges of these prizes? Were they Liverpool-based? Did they change? What was their composition? And did you was that one of the other data sets you were using to kind of assess, you know, how these things were given prizes or not given prizes? Because it feels like it's a prize and we sort of need to know who are making the judgments. So your paper just kind of brought that out for me in Hannah's.
Really good question, and something that I do enjoy delving into. So, John Moore's always sort of presided over the panel for sort of like the first at least 30 years of the prize. Is this working? Is it okay? Sorry, microphone for you. Yeah, so John Moore's presided. Hugh Scruton, who was the director of the Walker Art Gallery, was on the panel until his retirement for quite some years. In the first 1957 panel, John Burgess should have sat, but was ill and couldn't make it. And so the composition for the first 30 years of the prize was all male. And they had figures from around the art world, so they would have like a well-known critic, an academic, directors of national galleries. They weren't necessarily local, although the director of the Walker was always present, and John Moore's had his own agenda. So although he might not be a judge, I think occasionally there were comments. What is really interesting is Mary Martin was a joint winner in the 1960s, joint winner. The first female winner, solo winner, 1987, Sarah Milroy, is the first time that it's an all-woman panel. And I don't think there's a woman on the jury before then. So just really interesting in terms of these judgments, even though the artwork is anonymously judged, there are these subconscious and subtextual value judgments taking place. And it's a subject of future research, I think.
I think that's fascinating. The other question I was going to ask you was whether, and sorry to bring it back to kind of London, but did you talk about in those kind of collaborative research sessions with this data, whether or not it would be interesting to compare this prize to, the most comparable London-based prize and those sort of data sets through the summer exhibition, or something even more specific to painting, because there's also a kind of materiality question here, isn't there? That this was a painting prize, perhaps, and that might skew some of that data about who participated.
Yeah, there are definitely questions about comparison and what we would find. However, it's too big.
Yeah.
And there's no direct comparison. And I think because it is so distinctly regional, because it was set up with the specific intention of regenerating a culture on Merseyside, I think maybe it would do it a disservice to compare too closely to another prize. Obviously there are those mirrorings of the kind of big hitters who might be winning other prizes, but what's more interesting to us is what lies below the surface there, I think. So I think maybe in the future when the John Moore's Painting Prize has been looked at a bit more, and when we have really established that disruption between the chain of commands between the centre and periphery, and when we're talking more about the interregional and the transregional and the transnational, and how those systems of circulation work, because they're not back and forth, they're very convoluted. I think maybe there might be more time there for those comparisons and those discussions.
Thank you. Ella, I wanted to ask you, so a lot of what you were saying, I was furiously scribbling down and thinking about kind of the role of the regional museum, and actually some of the comments you were making about at the end about what regional museums should be programming and whether or not they're freer to program these sort of, undiscovered or should be there but aren't necessarily there in the kind of canon, and is somehow their role working in a regional gallery where actually the collection is not local, and the kind of founding of the collection was very specifically to be compared to a national context. So this was kind of the Barber in the 30s, and we had this really, brilliant woman leader of this space, but actually she, in her deed, said that the judgment value should be the National Gallery and the Wallace collection. So it was absolutely not a kind of regional comparator. That's not my question. My question really was, it was something that you said, Hana, and I was just thinking, you were saying at the beginning of your presentation how actually still very little has been done about this sort of regional exhibiting, regional collecting, and you've done so much work on this now, Ella, through your PhD. to what extent do you think there's it's still an unmined area of research from what you've been discovering? And are there reasons for this? Is it about accessibility to archives? Is the material not there, or is it just not kind of known?
Yeah, I feel like there's lots of reasons, and there's definitely so many opportunities for further study. Like just hearing some of the talks today, like ideas are going through my mind of like, oh, they'd be so interested to go down that like rabbit hole and explore that collection. I think maybe one of the reasons which I've always found is like for the regional galleries, I just don't think they're very well visited and used by schools. Like when I was at school, I didn't even know there was a local art gallery near to me. We never visited it. And it just feels like such a shame. I think if we introduced students to regional galleries at an earlier stage and told them that they were worthwhile exploring, rather than just always pulling them to like the nationals, it'd be one of these ways to kind of really improve the field of research.
Thank you. Thank you. Could I open it out to questions from the audience? Yeah, there's one just there. If you could say your name and your affiliation, if you're happy to.
Hi, I'm Naomi Pearce, Aberystwyth University. Thank you very much, both, for your talks. I really, really enjoyed them. I wanted to pick up on something that Ella said. You said patterns of friendship and collaboration, and I wanted to connect that with your talk, Hana, and just ask if there was any analysis that had been done on the data in terms of the artists and how they were connected or not, who were applying, and whether there were those patterns of friendship and collaboration there, basically.
Okay, so there's a pin in that. That is one of the reasons why we were asking about art schools, and something that I'm really interested in tracing is art teachers who've submitted and won prizes and the students who have followed in their footsteps and what those connections are. And as you trace those journeys from, we found already just in the first few years that increasingly students are establishing themselves in London. So the statistics are gradually creeping upwards. Even whilst, well, in the 50s and 60s, the centralisation of funding models is still ongoing. So we think that has something to do with it. But yeah, tracing those friendships, those connections between regional curators and directors, I think is going to be really important, because the regional directors at other institutions are collecting work straight from the prize hang. They're picking them up off the wall and taking them back with them, and what those relationships are is really curious and interesting. And yeah, the relationship between how those collections of post-war British painting are founded, and the subject matter that people are going for, I think will be an interesting connection to make visible.
Just to add to that as well, through my research for the Arts Council collection with Sophie Hatchwell as well, Greg Salter and Alana Pardo on a collaborative project, I was trying to trace the friendships between the artists who were collected, and I very much saw the art schools as such an important aspect. People who are on the purchasing committee for the Arts Council collection were quite often tutors at the art schools, and then they would, recommend their students. That's how they got to know which artworks were, maybe would be worth collecting.
Thanks. It just occurs to me today that we're talking very much about status, about people who are outside of the norm, who have been forgotten through time or are still forgotten today, and exclusion, for whatever reason. And I wondered how much have we internalized that ourselves. So if you think about whenever you introduce an artist, you automatically say where they were born, what age they are. You mention their sexuality if it's outside the norm. You never say this is a cisgendered person. So that person never has to introspect about how they're being presented to the rest of the world. And I feel like we've internalized that normalization, where they've studied, for example. So who have we in ourselves, we could think about, supported, who champions, self-taught outsider artists, for example. There are people, there are bodies who do that. And I just wonder how much we seek them out and how much we normalize excluding those people that we all seem to care about so much, just through the normal way we talk and address things and write things.
Yeah, I completely agree. Although I find it so difficult to balance ideas of kind of public accessibility as well, because to introduce unfamiliar artists to audiences, I think sometimes if you get like a wide public visiting and they want to get like a grounding that they understand, a system that they understand. So one curatorial challenge I think we need to address and really work on is how to integrate these different structures of knowledge whilst also making the narratives quite accessible to the public.
I also think there were some problems in the research that maybe underpins those methods of curating, in that we couldn't find data on some of the artists. So although the prize maybe encouraged a wider field of entry of people who do fall outside of standard categorization that could really help to challenge our automatic sort of forwarding of those categorizations, there are a lot of those artists there is no information for. So yeah, it needs careful investigation, I think. But you're so right about that. And some of the work that the early career researchers are going to do with the data audit is to look at different ways to redefine and recategorize so that that binary isn't so apparent.
Thank you. It's a really important question, I think, and it kind of links back to what you were saying earlier today, Dominic, about what you've done around database work. Oh, sorry. What you've been doing around the work to make sure that knowledge and ways of speaking and ways of presenting data is kind of kept in a way by the systems that museums are. So yeah, thank you. Good question. Sarah,
we've got two questions from online. So
thank you.
Will put them both together, and Hannah and Ella can decide which one, or if they're going to answer both. So thank you to our audience online who are putting in questions. So we've got a question from Rebecca Wade at the University of Leeds, and Rebecca asked to both presenters, was inter-regional competition a factor in these exhibitions? So quite interesting to break out of the kind of London region model and think across regions. And then a question from Pamela Marathu at the University of Toronto in Canada. Welcome, Pamela. Did either of you look at the data that captured Black and or racialised artists, both female and male? Thanks.
In terms of interregional, it's a really interesting kind of area of exploration, because I found that through comparing various regional galleries, they would kind of establish an identity for themselves, which was very much in consideration of what the other art galleries were doing in their region, to be different from them. So, for example, York Art Gallery has a ceramic centre, and that's very different to the Lane, which has a massive watercolour collection. So I think there's definite consideration, but also in the 1980s, for example, they were sharing, lending around, like loaning works by women artists. So I think they were also kind of creating these more hidden networks. So kind of similarities, but also these on the face, quite different regional identities.
So in terms of the interregional, we do have the raw data to work with for the different sort of the personal migrations of those artists, and we will be able to look at the groupings. We think it's really important, it's really key to the histories that we're trying to surface and to the the disruption of that centre periphery model, but we have yet to really crunch it. In terms of Black artists and artists of global ethnic majority heritage, it's one of the questions that we set out to look at, and then when we were kind of discussing the categories as we undertook the audit, there was a question of, well, how would you know? It doesn't actually stipulate in the catalogue, and so we attempted to find out where people were born, and to find out It was a difficult category because we didn't just want to know whether people were born in specific places. We wanted to get a fuller picture of the regions nationally and internationally in which people were born. So I think there's important work to be done there. I mean, there is Angela Dalal Clayton's audit as well, where I think Angelique specifically went into archives with her very complete knowledge of the names and practice of specific artists who she was looking to find. And we didn't necessarily have that expertise personally and at our sort of desktops as we worked. So it's a really interesting topic to continue to delve into, I think.
Hello, my name's Jonathan Watts, and I'm here from Norwich University of the Arts. And I think I've got an observation that might turn into a question. I'm writing my PhD on East International, which was an annual submission open exhibition that was at the art school in Norwich. And what's so interesting about that, I think, is that its entire lifespan, 19 years from 91 to 2009, it was funded. The patron was the Regional Arts Association, which was then centralised and merged as the Arts Council, and the art school itself. And there was this kind of this desire on the part of Lynda Morris, who organised East, to franchise out this model that would be cited within art schools in the north, the south, the east, and the west. And there's something quite interesting there about like a changed profile of what the art school is, because I think today we tend not to think about art schools as being art centres. I mean, you've all talked about like regional art galleries and their role and their relationship to patrons and so on. But art schools were art centres that, historically there had been more porous spaces that were more public-facing, where you could go in and you could interface with international artists who perhaps were friends with tutors, but, and so I guess there's kind of two things there that this is my observation, I suppose, is that there's a decline of the regional arts associations, which has kind of led to a kind of over-centralisation through something like the Arts Council of Great Britain, but also there's, the merging of the art schools and the kind of centralisation of power around a smaller number of art schools, which that's not turned into a question, I'm afraid. It's sort of an observation, but I think there's something in there just in terms of thinking about where sites of power are to develop meaningful cultures and infrastructures for artist practice and collecting.
Yeah, I think just on that, it'd be quite interesting to kind of explore more what we mean by civic pride now, because I know for Giles Waterfield's book about regional galleries, he was talking about the local art schools as like a source of civic pride. And of course, this is why many of these regional galleries were built in the first place in this Victorian era. But as we're trying to diversify collections and represent different communities, what do kind of geographical loci actually mean now, like for the regional gallery? And then just also another point, the Women's Art Collection at Cambridge at Murray Edwards College is really interesting, just when you were saying in terms of centres, artistic schools are centres, because Cambridge doesn't offer a fine art syllabus, yet many works within its collections are by students who actually studied at the college. So they've kind of got this collection of students who were art practitioners, but also they might have been studying, natural sciences. And there's also a collection of works from artists who aren't connected with the college. So it's quite an interesting confluence to maybe look more into.
Okay. Thank you so much. I feel like that might be a kind of provocation, call to action around supporting art schools in our regions, which even in the West Midlands they're closing. So thank you for that, and good point to finish on. Thank you very much to our panellists. Give them a round of applause.